pull up, we're losing altitude.
I'm trying, I can't stabilize it. We're losing control. I can't stabilize the dive. Pull up!
Give me the yoke, I have the controls. Stall! Pull up!
We're crashing. Please tell me this isn't true. I can't breathe. I don't know what to do.
Pilots screamed, "Stop! We are already dead," until a farmer came into the cockpit. The sun had just begun to rise, spilling soft golden light across the tarmac, and the smell of jet fuel mixed faintly with the crisp air. Flight 312 was scheduled to depart at 8:30 a.m., a short route between two cities, a journey that hundreds of passengers had taken many times before. The crew, Captain Rajiv and First Officer Mira, were experienced pilots. Both had logged thousands of hours in the air, and they were known for their professionalism and calm demeanor. The passengers, meanwhile, were unsuspecting, busy with their own thoughts, routines, and expectations for the day. Among the travelers was Arjun, a middle-aged farmer returning from a nearby town where he had sold his crops. He had been traveling for several hours by bus, but had decided to take the plane this time for the sake of speed. Arjun was a simple man, dressed in faded clothes and dusty boots, carrying a small bag with personal belongings. He had no idea that this seemingly ordinary flight would soon become the most terrifying experience of his life. The boarding process was normal. Flight attendants welcomed passengers with polite smiles, helping the elderly and guiding families with children to their seats. Arjun found his place near the back of the plane and settled in, staring quietly out of the window. Below him, the airport buzzed with activity. Luggage carts moved back and forth, maintenance workers checked engines, and other aircraft prepared for takeoff. The hum of distant engines and the chatter of the crew added to a sense of ordinary normalcy. Captain Rajiv walked into the cockpit with First Officer Mira, exchanging friendly greetings. They checked the flight plan, confirmed fuel levels, and performed their standard pre-flight procedures. Everything appeared normal, just like any other flight. Mira glanced at the radar screens and instruments, double-checking the systems. "Looks good," she said, her tone professional but calm. Rajiv nodded, confident in their preparations. He had flown in far worse weather, dealt with mechanical issues before, and was trained to handle emergencies. At that moment, nothing seemed out of place. The passengers had already fastened their seatbelts, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. The engines roared steadily, a sound that most travelers took for granted, though for pilots it was a language of its own. Captain Rajiv adjusted the throttle, and soon the plane lifted smoothly into the sky. The city below became smaller with every passing minute, a patchwork of streets, buildings, and fields. Arjun watched in quiet awe, marveling at the beauty of the landscape, the tiny rivers sparkling in the morning sun, the trees casting long shadows across the land. For a few moments, he felt a rare sense of peace, forgetting the stress of his work and the worries that usually weighed on his shoulders. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of flight. Passengers chatted quietly, some read books or scrolled through their phones, while others simply stared out the windows at the clouds drifting by. Flight attendants walked the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, answering questions and making small talk. Everything seemed perfectly normal. There was a sense of routine, a quiet assurance that the journey would be smooth. But then, without warning, the first signs of trouble appeared. It started subtly at first, a faint vibration that passengers could barely feel, a small flicker on the cockpit instruments. Captain Rajiv noticed it immediately. He frowned and adjusted a few controls, thinking it might be a minor fluctuation. Mira followed his lead, checking the systems for any irregularities. "Could be turbulence," she suggested, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Outside the plane, the clouds seemed ordinary, white and fluffy, with no indication of a storm or strong winds. But the vibrations grew stronger. The plane began to shake more noticeably, a low rumble vibrating through the cabin. Passengers looked up from their seats, startled. Some gripped the armrests, unsure of what was happening. Flight attendants quickly moved through the aisles, trying to calm the nervous travelers. "Please remain calm," they said, their voices steady but tinged with concern. "This is normal turbulence. The pilots are handling it." Captain Rajiv's hands moved swiftly over the controls, his eyes darting between the instruments. The alarms began to beep, faint at first but growing louder. A red warning light flashed on the panel, signaling a problem with the engines. Rajiv's stomach tightened. He had dealt with engine warnings before, but never like this. Both engines were showing signs of failure almost simultaneously. Mira's face mirrored his concern. "This isn't normal," she muttered, more to herself than to him. The realization hit them both like a cold wave. The aircraft was in serious trouble. In the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers who had been chatting and laughing a moment ago now looked around in confusion. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Children clung to their parents, sensing the tension even if they did not fully understand it. Arjun felt his heart pounding in his chest, a tight knot of fear forming in his stomach. He looked around at the other travelers, seeing their faces pale and tense, their eyes wide with uncertainty. The ordinary morning had suddenly turned into a nightmare. The plane began to shudder violently, dropping slightly in altitude. The sound of the engines changed, a high-pitched whine accompanied by deep rumbles that made the floor vibrate beneath the passengers' feet. Flight attendants struggled to maintain their balance as they tried to secure the cabin. Some passengers screamed, others cried quietly, while a few froze completely, unable to comprehend what was happening. The sense of panic was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone inside the aircraft. Captain Rajiv's voice came over the intercom, calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We are experiencing technical difficulties, and the crew is taking all necessary actions to ensure your safety." The words were meant to reassure, but they did little to ease the fear that had gripped the cabin. Mira called out to Rajiv, reporting additional warnings flashing on her screen. "Both engines are showing critical alerts," she said, her voice steady but tense. Rajiv felt a cold sweat forming on his forehead. This was a situation he had never encountered before. Outside, the sky remained deceptively calm. The clouds drifted lazily, and the sun continued to shine. But inside the plane, chaos reigned. The aircraft's altitude fluctuated erratically, and every bump and lurch sent shivers through the passengers. Arjun gripped the seat in front of him, trying to stay calm, but his mind raced with fear. He had no training for this, no knowledge of aviation, yet he could sense the gravity of the situation. People around him were trembling, praying, and bracing themselves for the worst. Captain Rajiv and Mira worked furiously in the cockpit, their training guiding their actions. They attempted multiple adjustments to stabilize the engines, but nothing seemed to work. The alarms continued to blare, flashing warnings highlighting the severity of the problem. Every second felt like an eternity. Rajiv's thoughts raced. How had both engines failed at the same time? Was this a mechanical fault, human error, or something beyond explanation? He shook his head, trying to focus, but the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He knew the lives of everyone on board depended on their next moves. In the cabin, fear turned into audible panic. Passengers shouted to one another, some begging for help, others trying to comfort friends and family. Arjun looked around, noticing a young mother clutching her child tightly, her face pale and trembling. An elderly man muttered prayers under his breath, while a teenager stared blankly, frozen by shock. The ordinary flight had become a terrifying ordeal, a test of survival against forces beyond human control. As the plane continued to shake and dip, Rajiv and Mira exchanged a glance. Words were unnecessary. Their expressions conveyed the same horrifying realization. They were in a fight for survival, and the odds were grim. Rajiv whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "We're already dead." The words hung in the air, a chilling acknowledgement of the danger they faced. Yet, despite the fear, both pilots continued to work, determined to find a solution, their hands moving over controls with precision born of years of experience. The turbulence worsened, now accompanied by a strange metallic groaning from the plane's structure. Passengers clutched their seats, some closing their eyes, silently praying for a miracle. Flight attendants tried to maintain calm, holding onto rails and assisting those who panicked. Arjun felt a surge of adrenaline, a strange clarity amid the chaos. He didn't know what to do, but he sensed that someone had to act, to stay focused, and to somehow help. The ordinary farmer who had spent his life in fields and markets suddenly found himself at the center of a life-or-death situation unlike anything he had imagined. As the plane continued its unstable flight, the story of that ordinary morning turned into a tale of suspense and fear. Every second brought new challenges, every alarm a reminder of the fragility of life. And yet, amid the terror, a glimmer of hope remained, a hope that would soon manifest in the most unexpected way, changing the fate of everyone on board. The plane continued to shake violently, and every second felt like a lifetime. The gentle hum of the engines from earlier was now replaced by a terrifying combination of groaning metal, warning alarms, and the loud, panicked voices of the passengers. Captain Rajiv and First Officer Mira were in the cockpit, fully aware that the situation was critical. Both engines were failing, and every attempt to stabilize the aircraft seemed futile. Rajiv's hands moved quickly across the controls, pushing buttons, adjusting throttles, and trying every emergency procedure he had memorized during years of training. Mira was doing the same. Her eyes darted from one instrument to another, scanning for anything that could help. Every gauge, every flashing light was a signal of danger. The plane's altitude was dropping, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in slow, terrifying spirals. The cabin shook so badly that passengers were thrown against their seatbelts, some gripping their arms tightly to keep from being tossed around. The fear was infectious. Every person on the plane could feel the panic of those around them. Even the most stoic passengers looked around with wide eyes, whispering prayers or calling out for help. Arjun, the farmer, clutched the armrest in front of him, his knuckles white from the pressure. His heart was pounding so loudly he felt like it might burst. He had never been in a situation like this. In his life, he had faced floods, storms, and accidents in the fields, but nothing like this. He could see the desperation on the faces of the pilots through the small window of the cockpit. He could hear the faint hum of their calm voices struggling to stay controlled, but he also sensed the fear hidden beneath the professionalism. When Rajiv muttered under his breath, "We are already dead," Arjun's heart sank further. The words were chilling, and he felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. But the farmer was not someone who gave in easily. Years of hard work in the fields had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to think quickly, and to act decisively when lives depended on it. He looked around the cabin and saw the terrified faces of children, mothers, and elderly passengers. He knew that panicking would only make things worse. He reminded himself to focus, to observe, and to look for any way to help. Something inside him told him that even in this impossible situation, a miracle could happen if someone acted. The plane dropped sharply, causing screams from the passengers. Some hit the ceiling with their heads, others fell forward into the seats in front of them. The flight attendants struggled to keep themselves upright, holding onto rails as they tried to reassure the passengers. "Stay seated, stay calm," one shouted, but her voice was almost drowned out by the roaring engines and the shouts from passengers. The fear in the cabin was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. People were crying, shouting, and clinging to loved ones, some shaking uncontrollably. Captain Rajiv's face was pale, his forehead covered in sweat. He tried to communicate with the control tower, hoping for guidance or instructions, but the radio signal was weak, static-filled, and unreliable. Every word was difficult to hear, every instruction fragmented. He shouted into the microphone, trying to make himself heard, but the response was delayed and garbled. He looked at Mira, whose eyes were wide but focused. Both of them knew they had very little time to act, that the plane was in danger of crashing at any moment. Mira's hands moved quickly, pressing buttons, flipping switches, and trying to override the failing systems. She had trained for emergency situations, but this was beyond what she had imagined. Both engines were critical, and the plane was losing altitude fast. The turbulence made every movement difficult. The cockpit rattled violently, and the alarms continued to sound, almost deafening in their intensity. She turned to Rajiv and said, "I don't know if we can hold it. We need another way." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Arjun began to notice small details that others might have missed. He observed the movement of the aircraft, the way it leaned slightly to one side, and the small signals from the instruments visible through the cockpit window. Though he had never flown a plane before, he had worked with machinery all his life. He had repaired tractors, irrigation systems, and other engines, and he had learned to notice patterns, to respond quickly, and to act decisively when a mechanism was failing. Something told him that perhaps he could help, if only he could get the attention of the pilots. Summoning courage he did not know he had, Arjun stood up, holding onto the seat in front of him as the plane jolted violently. He began moving toward the cockpit, calling out, "Please, I can help, just let me try." Passengers turned to look at him, some in disbelief, others in hope. Flight attendants tried to stop him, saying, "Sir, you cannot," but the urgency in his voice was undeniable. Rajiv, hearing the commotion, opened the cockpit door slightly, glancing at the farmer. At first, he was confused. Who was this man, and how could he possibly help? But he could see the desperation in Arjun's eyes, the determination, and something about his presence seemed different. "Come in," Rajiv said reluctantly. Mira looked shocked, but she did not stop him. Arjun stepped carefully into the cockpit, his mind racing. He had no formal training in aviation, no pilot's license, and no experience with aircraft emergencies. But he could see patterns on the instruments, understand the basics of mechanical failures, and think logically under pressure. He looked at the pilots and said, "Tell me exactly what each alarm means. Show me what you've tried. Maybe I can help stabilize it." Rajiv and Mira exchanged an uncertain glance but began explaining the situation. Both engines had critical warnings, the plane was losing altitude, and every attempt to correct the problem had failed. Arjun listened carefully, nodding. He observed the instruments, noting patterns in the readings and subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior. "Okay," he said calmly, "we need to balance the controls carefully. Let's adjust this slowly and monitor it step by step." The pilots were skeptical but willing to try anything. Together, they began following Arjun's guidance. His calm voice contrasted sharply with the chaos outside, and for the first time, there was a sense of hope in the cockpit. Arjun instructed them to adjust the throttles gradually, to stabilize the wings, and to monitor the instruments closely. His simple, clear instructions gave the pilots a focus they desperately needed. The plane continued to shake, but slowly, very slowly, the extreme movements began to lessen. Back in the cabin, passengers noticed the subtle change. The violent shaking was still present, but it was slightly less intense. Mothers whispered prayers of thanks, and children clung to their parents with a glimmer of hope. Flight attendants exchanged amazed looks, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. The tension in the cabin remained, but it was now accompanied by a fragile hope that survival was possible. Arjun's presence in the cockpit was almost surreal. A farmer, someone with no aviation experience, was now guiding two seasoned pilots through one of the most dangerous situations imaginable. He remained calm, focused, and precise. Every instruction he gave was clear and deliberate, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Rajiv and Mira followed his guidance meticulously, adjusting the plane's controls under his careful direction. Minutes passed like hours. The plane continued to descend, but with each passing second, the situation became slightly more stable. The alarms still sounded, and the instruments still flashed warnings, but the extreme danger was slowly lessening. Rajiv allowed himself to breathe a little, though he knew they were not yet out of danger. Mira kept her focus sharp, her hands ready to respond to any sudden changes. Arjun's calm determination was the thread holding this fragile hope together. The passengers in the cabin began to notice small improvements. The violent dips were less frequent, the sudden jolts less severe. They began to whisper among themselves, quietly acknowledging that something incredible was happening. Even in the midst of terror, they felt the first hint of relief. Arjun's ability to remain calm, think logically, and communicate clearly was the reason they were still alive. As the plane continued its turbulent descent, Rajiv and Mira realized that survival depended on precise coordination. Every action had to be carefully timed, every adjustment made with care. Arjun guided them, explaining step by step what to do. "We need to reduce the descent slowly," he said. "Adjust the engines just a little, monitor the balance, and don't rush anything." The pilots nodded, following his instructions carefully. Slowly, the plane's movements became more controlled, the turbulence still felt but no longer life-threatening. The atmosphere in the cockpit was tense but focused. The pilots were still wary, knowing that the plane could lose control at any moment, but they had found a lifeline in the farmer's unexpected expertise. Arjun's calm presence gave them a sense of direction in the chaos, a strategy in the face of disaster. His ability to think clearly under pressure was extraordinary, and it was the difference between hope and despair. Outside, the sky remained calm and indifferent to the drama unfolding inside the plane. Clouds drifted lazily, birds flew far below, and the sun continued to shine. Yet inside, a battle between life and death was being fought in the cockpit. Every second mattered, every movement could be critical. And amid it all, a simple farmer was the unexpected hero, guiding the pilots toward survival. The plane was still trembling, its descent slowing but far from stable. Inside the cockpit, the tension was almost unbearable. Captain Rajiv and First Officer Mira had regained a small measure of control thanks to Arjun's calm guidance, but the danger was far from over. Every instrument, every gauge, and every warning light reminded them of the fragile state of the aircraft. The passengers in the cabin clutched their seats, eyes wide, silently hoping that the nightmare would end safely. Arjun remained composed, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. He was no pilot, yet somehow he understood what needed to be done. He observed the readings, analyzed patterns, and instructed the pilots with clarity that cut through the chaos. "Balance the throttles slowly," he said. "We can't rush. Adjust a little at a time, watch the wings. We must stay level." His words were calm, yet carried the weight of authority, the kind that comes from practical experience and clear thinking under pressure. Rajiv adjusted the throttles as instructed, feeling the subtle difference in the plane's movements. The violent dips were less frequent, the sudden lurches smaller. Mira kept a steady eye on the instruments, following Arjun's guidance precisely. Slowly, the plane's descent became more controlled. Though they were still far from safety, the glimmer of hope had returned. They realized that, against all odds, they had a chance to survive. In the cabin, the passengers began to sense a subtle change. The shaking was still present, but it was no longer chaotic. Mothers whispered quietly to their children, urging them to hold on, while the elderly clasped each other's hands in silent prayer. The murmurs of fear were slowly replaced by cautious optimism. People began to whisper about the farmer who had entered the cockpit, guiding the pilots in a situation that seemed impossible. Arjun had become an unexpected beacon of hope, a calm presence amid overwhelming panic. Minutes stretched on like hours. The plane continued its turbulent flight, but Arjun's steady instructions kept it from spiraling into disaster. "Watch the wings," he said. "Don't let the left dip too much. Gradually, we can level out." Rajiv and Mira followed each instruction carefully, their trust in the farmer growing with every successful adjustment. Slowly, the violent shaking diminished further, replaced by smaller, more manageable movements. It was a delicate dance between skill, instinct, and intuition. Arjun's experience in the fields had taught him patience and observation. He knew that panicking would only make the situation worse. He watched the instruments, the plane's subtle tilts, and the changes in engine sound. Every small adjustment mattered. "Carefully, just a little more," he instructed, his voice steady. The pilots listened, acting with precision, and the plane responded. For the first time since the alarms had begun, there was a sense of control returning. Outside, the world seemed calm and unaware of the drama unfolding thousands of feet in the air. Clouds drifted lazily, the sun shone brightly, and birds flew far below. But inside the plane, a battle between fear and hope was being fought. The passengers could feel the tension, the constant vibration of the cabin reminding them of the danger. And yet, with each passing minute, the possibility of survival became more real. Arjun continued to guide the pilots with careful instructions. "We need to stabilize the engines further," he said. "Keep the throttle steady for a few moments. Don't overcorrect." "We can do this." Rajiv and Mira adjusted as he directed, the plane's movements becoming more predictable, the instruments gradually stabilizing. The cockpit was still tense, but there was a sense of teamwork forming between the three of them. The farmer's presence had changed the dynamic completely. In the cabin, passengers began to notice the change. The plane was still shaking, but it no longer felt uncontrollable. Some closed their eyes in cautious relief, while others whispered prayers of gratitude. Flight attendants moved carefully through the aisles, offering reassurance, though their own faces revealed the lingering fear. Everyone on board felt the impact of the farmer's calm presence, though few could see him directly. He was quietly changing the fate of everyone on the flight. Arjun's instructions became more detailed as he observed the instruments closely. "We need to make minor adjustments to the flaps," he said. "Gently, slowly. Too fast and it could destabilize the plane again." Rajiv nodded, carefully following his guidance. Mira adjusted the flaps as instructed, and the plane responded positively. The violent lurches decreased further, and the aircraft began to level out. The passengers could feel the difference immediately. The shaking was still there, but it was no longer life-threatening. A cautious sense of hope spread throughout the cabin. The pilots exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had managed to regain partial control, but the danger was not over. "We need to find a place to land," Rajiv said. "We can't stay in the air like this. We need a runway somewhere safe." Arjun nodded. "Yes," he said. "We need to focus on controlled flight first, then look for a landing spot. We can do this step by step." His voice remained calm, confident, and reassuring. As the plane continued to fly, the crew began scanning the ground below for potential landing sites. Arjun observed patterns in the terrain, recognizing open fields and flat areas that could serve as emergency landing spots. "There's an airstrip not far from here," he said. "It's small, but it should be enough. We can aim for it, but carefully." Rajiv nodded, trusting the farmer's judgment. Mira adjusted the instruments and confirmed the location. For the first time since the crisis began, there was a clear plan. The descent toward the emergency landing site was slow and deliberate. Arjun instructed the pilots to keep the plane steady, to monitor every movement and to adjust gradually. "Patience is key," he said. "Don't rush. One mistake now could undo everything we've done." Rajiv and Mira followed his guidance meticulously, their hands moving with precision as they adjusted the throttles, flaps, and wings. The plane responded, gradually aligning with the airstrip below. In the cabin, passengers watched through the windows, their fear slowly turning into cautious hope. They could see the land approaching, the runway visible in the distance. Mothers held their children tightly, whispering prayers of gratitude. Elderly passengers clasped hands and muttered silent thanks. Everyone was aware that survival was now within reach, thanks to the extraordinary calm and guidance of a farmer who had never flown a plane before. Arjun continued to give precise instructions. "Keep the speed steady. Don't let the nose dip too much. We need to touch down gently." Rajiv and Mira followed his advice carefully, their trust in him absolute. The plane's descent was controlled, its movements smoother, though the tension in the cockpit remained high. Every second was critical, every adjustment mattered. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, causing minor turbulence, but the team in the cockpit remained focused. Minutes passed slowly. The runway grew larger in the windows, the outline of the airstrip becoming clear. Arjun instructed the pilots to begin the final adjustments. "Line up with the runway, keep the wings level, gradually reduce speed. We're almost there." Rajiv nodded, hands steady, eyes focused on the path ahead. Mira adjusted the flaps and throttles exactly as directed. The plane responded perfectly, approaching the ground in a controlled descent. The cabin was tense. Passengers gripped their seats, some holding their breath, others whispering prayers. The plane wobbled slightly but remained on course. Arjun's calm voice continued to guide the pilots. "Gently, gently, we're almost there." The plane touched down on the runway with a jolt, bouncing slightly but remaining intact. The tires screeched against the tarmac, and the cabin shook as the plane slowed. The passengers erupted in quiet relief, some crying, others laughing through their tears. Captain Rajiv and First Officer Mira exhaled deeply, their hands finally relaxing on the controls. They had survived the impossible, guided by an unexpected hero who had walked into their cockpit and changed the outcome of what could have been a tragedy. Arjun looked around, modest and calm, even as the passengers and crew began to realize the enormity of what had just occurred. He had remained composed, focused, and brave, using his intuition and practical experience to guide the plane to safety. Emergency crews rushed toward the plane, ready to assist. Passengers began to disembark, some still shaking, others hugging loved ones tightly. News of the miraculous landing spread quickly. Everyone wanted to know the story of the farmer who had stepped into the cockpit and saved the lives of dozens of people. Arjun quietly gathered his belongings, humble and unassuming, unaware of the fame that awaited him. He had acted out of instinct and courage, doing what he felt was right. The pilots, passengers, and crew would never forget the events of that day. A routine flight had turned into a battle for survival, and a simple farmer had become the unlikely hero. The terror, the fear, and the chaos had tested every person on board. But through calm thinking, precise action, and courage under pressure, disaster had been averted. What remained was a story of hope, bravery, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people to change the course of events in the most unexpected ways. The plane's tires screeched against the runway as it touched down, bouncing slightly but holding steady. The violent tremors that had plagued the flight were finally giving way to controlled motion. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rajiv's hands were still on the controls, but the tension that had gripped him for hours began to ease. Mira's shoulders relaxed just a fraction, though her eyes remained on the instruments, ready for any unexpected shift. Arjun, the farmer who had guided them through this terrifying ordeal, remained calm and composed, his steady voice still echoing in the minds of the pilots. As the plane slowed along the tarmac, passengers in the cabin began to react. Some who had been clutching their seats in terror now exhaled deeply, tears streaming down their faces. Mothers hugged their children tightly, whispering words of relief and gratitude. Elderly passengers shook hands with strangers, unable to believe they had survived. A low murmur of awe and disbelief ran through the cabin. No one could fully articulate the fear they had just experienced, nor the miracle of survival they were witnessing. Flight attendants quickly moved through the aisles, assisting passengers as they began to unbuckle their seatbelts. Some helped calm those who were still trembling, while others offered water and reassurance. The cabin, once filled with panic and chaos, was now slowly settling into a mix of relief and lingering tension. The passengers were exhausted, physically and emotionally drained from the ordeal, yet their gratitude and respect for the heroes in the cockpit were palpable. Arjun, standing modestly near the cockpit entrance, looked out at the passengers. He had never seen anything like this in his life. He had faced storms and challenges in his fields, but never a situation where so many lives were hanging in the balance. He didn't consider himself a hero. He had acted out of instinct, courage, and a desire to help. Yet the gratitude in the eyes of the pilots and passengers was undeniable, and he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction in knowing that his actions had made a difference. Captain Rajiv finally exhaled, the tension in his body releasing slightly. He turned to Mira, who gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. "We did it," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible over the background noise. Rajiv allowed himself a small smile, though he knew the danger was not entirely over. The plane still needed to come to a complete stop safely, and they had to navigate taxiing along the runway without incident. Every second still required attention and care. The emergency crews had arrived at the airstrip, ready to assist the passengers as soon as the plane came to a full stop. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue personnel waited anxiously, watching the aircraft inch closer. Their presence added a layer of reassurance to the passengers, many of whom still clutched their seats nervously, their hearts racing from the adrenaline of the flight. The pilots guided the plane carefully along the runway, following Arjun's calm instructions, to ensure that no sudden movement caused additional panic or danger. As the plane finally came to a complete halt, a cheer erupted from some of the passengers. Others remained silent, still processing the intensity of what had just occurred. Flight attendants opened the doors and began assisting passengers to exit the aircraft, helping those who were unsteady on their feet and ensuring that everyone moved safely. The passengers stepped onto the tarmac, many of them taking deep breaths of fresh air, overwhelmed by the relief and gratitude that filled the moment. News crews and emergency personnel gathered around, curious about the miraculous landing. Word had already spread that something extraordinary had taken place. A farmer had entered the cockpit during a critical emergency and helped guide the pilots to safety. People began taking note of Arjun, who stood quietly on the tarmac, modest and unassuming despite the attention. Reporters approached him, cameras flashing, but he remained calm, politely declining most questions. He had not sought recognition. He had acted out of instinct and bravery, and that was enough for him. Captain Rajiv and First Officer Mira exited the cockpit, faces still pale but marked by relief and gratitude. They approached Arjun and shook his hand, expressing their heartfelt thanks. "You saved all of us," Rajiv said, his voice trembling slightly. Mira added, "I can't believe what just happened. You guided us perfectly." "We owe our lives to you." Arjun shook his head modestly, smiling faintly. "I just did what I could. You did the hard work flying the plane. I just helped where I could." His humility only added to the awe and respect that everyone felt for him. The passengers, hearing the story, began to gather around Arjun as well. They wanted to meet the man who had kept his calm when all hope seemed lost. Some hugged him, others shook his hand, and many offered words of thanks and admiration. It was a surreal moment, a mix of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. People who had been strangers a few hours ago now shared a bond forged through fear, courage, and survival. The ordinary farmer had become a symbol of extraordinary bravery. Emergency personnel began escorting passengers to safety, guiding them to buses and medical checks, ensuring that everyone was accounted for. Despite the ordeal, there were no serious injuries, only the lingering effects of fear and adrenaline. Paramedics offered water and blankets to those who were shaking, while counselors spoke to passengers who were in shock. The situation had been catastrophic, yet thanks to the combined efforts of the pilots and Arjun, everyone had survived. Arjun, meanwhile, remained calm and composed, quietly observing the scene. He thought about the events of the past hours, the terror in the cabin, and the critical moments in the cockpit. He reflected on how ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges when the need was greatest. He thought about the passengers, their fear and relief, and realized that courage was not always about training or experience. It was about presence of mind, calmness, and the willingness to act when it mattered most. News of the miraculous survival spread quickly. Reporters and camera crews began interviewing passengers and crew, capturing the emotional moments of gratitude and awe. The story of the farmer who had saved lives went viral almost immediately. Social media was filled with headlines praising Arjun's bravery and quick thinking. People around the country were inspired by the story, amazed that a man with no aviation training could make such a critical difference in a life-threatening situation. Back at the airstrip, Captain Rajiv and First Officer Mira gave formal statements to the authorities. They explained how the simultaneous engine failure had created a scenario that seemed impossible to survive. They highlighted Arjun's critical role in guiding them through the emergency, emphasizing his calmness, intuition, and quick thinking. Their words painted a picture of extraordinary teamwork, courage, and resilience. Arjun listened quietly, still humble, acknowledging their praise but never seeking the spotlight. The passengers began boarding buses to be taken back to the airport terminal. Many spoke to reporters, recounting the terror of the flight and the relief of landing safely. They described the panic, the shaking of the plane, and the extraordinary presence of Arjun in the cockpit. Some were emotional, crying openly, while others expressed disbelief at the events that had just unfolded. Everyone agreed on one thing: the ordinary farmer had become an extraordinary hero. Arjun finally began to leave the airstrip, returning to his simple life. Despite the media attention and the admiration from passengers and crew, he remained humble. He thought about his fields, his crops, and the life he had left behind for a few hours of unimaginable intensity. He had acted instinctively, courageously, and effectively, and now he was returning to the quiet rhythm of his everyday life. Yet, he knew that the memory of this flight, the terror, and the survival would stay with him forever. In the days that followed, Arjun's story spread widely. He was invited to interviews, received letters of gratitude from passengers, and was recognized by aviation authorities for his courage. Yet he remained modest, always emphasizing that he had acted out of instinct, and that the real credit belonged to the pilots who followed his guidance and handled the plane with skill. His humility only deepened the admiration of people everywhere. Captain Rajiv and First Officer Mira continued their careers, forever changed by the experience. They often spoke of the farmer who had helped them survive, sharing the story as a lesson in courage, calmness, and the extraordinary potential of ordinary people. Passengers who survived the flight carried the story with them, grateful for their lives and inspired by the heroism they had witnessed. The flight had begun as a routine journey, but ended as a remarkable tale of survival and bravery. Arjun returned to his village, quietly resuming his daily work. He tended to his fields, interacted with his family and neighbors, and continued his life much as before. Yet in his heart he carried the memory of the flight, the fear, the tension, and the extraordinary responsibility that had been placed on him. He had faced a moment where lives depended on him, and he had acted with courage, clarity, and calmness. It was a day that would be remembered, a story of survival that would inspire countless others. In the end, the plane that had been on the brink of disaster had landed safely, thanks to the combination of skill, courage, and quick thinking. Captain Rajiv, First Officer Mira, and Arjun had faced one of the most dangerous situations imaginable and emerged victorious. The passengers had survived an ordeal that would forever change them, and a simple farmer had become a symbol of extraordinary bravery. The story served as a reminder that courage could come from the most unexpected places, that ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges, and that hope could prevail even in the darkest moments. The tale of that flight, the screaming alarms, the panicked passengers, and the calm farmer guiding the pilots to safety became legendary. It was told over and over, a story of fear, courage, and survival. People marveled at the power of calm thinking under pressure, at the bravery that arose from ordinary circumstances, and at the miraculous outcome of a day that could have ended in tragedy. And though Arjun returned to his quiet, simple life, his actions would be remembered forever, a testament to the extraordinary potential within ordinary people, a story of life, hope, and heroism that would never be forgotten.